So the introduction, again, looking at this, our purpose of DBS is protecting the public by helping employers make safer recruitment decisions and barring individuals who pose a risk to vulnerable groups from working in certain roles. And what we'll look at as well is around the eligibility, about making that safer recruitment. We will very briefly touch on barring, but we won't go into much of that in this presentation. And our vision, you can see there, we've got the DBS strategy for 2025, and it's about being a visible, trusted and influential organisation, providing outstanding quality of service to all our customers, which is yourselves and partners, and where people understand the important safeguarding contributions that they make and feel proud to work for DBS. I certainly do. I've been in post since November, and just being part of an organisation who is so committed to safeguarding children, vulnerable adults, and helping employers and organisations to make those safer recruitment decisions. It's certainly something that I'm very proud to be a part of. So the DBS operates under legislation, and you can see on the screen here, I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm not going to, death by legislation, but it does underpin everything that we do. We have different pieces of legislation which govern our disclosure and barring functions. So when I talk about disclosure, we're talking about our eligibility, who is entitled to what level of DBS check. And barring is when we receive a referral to say that if people believe that somebody is not suitable to work with children or vulnerable adults. So the legislation around it is complex, but we are trying very hard to help and support organisations and voluntary organisations to understand how that legislation works and what sits under what. As well as what we're going to go through here, there'll be a link at the end to various leaflets and guides that you can look into as well, which will provide a little bit more information and more detail. And they'll hopefully clarify some of the common misconceptions that there is around DBS checks. Okay, DBS and You. Okay, just a little bit of information here. DBS has issued 4.2 million standard and enhanced disclosures. 1.5 million update service subscribers, and we'll touch a little bit on the update service as we go through the presentation. 77.9k individuals barred from working with children or adults. If you think that's a lot of people, so it is really a vital function to understand safeguarding in your environment. And we've done 1.8 million basic disclosures. And what we will look at as well is a little bit around the eligibility, the difference between the basic, the standard and enhanced. We will cover that today. Okay. So DBS and You. Okay, it's important that you have good recruitment processes and practices in place. All right, DBS checks play a part in the process, but they should not be seen as the only safeguarding measure. One of the things that we say about having your safeguarding recruitment practices in place, it's around definitely your DBS disclosure, but also about references. Make sure that people get references when they're wanting to employ somebody. Employment history, check any gaps that that may present on an application form. What's gone on in that period? There's a whole host of things that can help and support when you're making that suitability decision, whether to employ somebody or not. It's not just around the DBS certificate. One of the things that employers must have in place is Rehabilitation of Offenders Act in terms of their recruitment policies. That means that if we look at Circle 2 here, we can act swiftly on any certificate information. So you'll know very clearly in your recruitment process, if something comes back on somebody's certificate that you want to employ, whether it be as a paid employee or a volunteer, that you are then clear about what you need to do and how you proceed with that information. All right. Looking at types of harmful behaviour and conduct. When we're looking at that, it's important that once someone is in post, that you have the right processes and procedures in place to ensure that they can recognise and you can recognise and act on harmful behaviour. Things like continuous professional development, and again, DBS, that's part of what we're doing here today. It's about development, it's about doing that training, imparting that education, about refresher training, etc. And DBS, we can help and support on that. We're not just here to issue certificates. Okay, also making it easy to have systems in place to disclose information which is essential, i.e. whistleblowing policies, and people are aware of their line of reporting. So if they do see something or are aware of something, what do they do with that information? How do they act on it? Keeping accurate records is vital when it comes to taking necessary and appropriate action to remove the risk of future harm. So if we do recognise something and we have come across something, one of the most important things is about removing that risk. So it's about what do we do, A, with the individual, and B, what do we do with our practices to avoid that from happening again. Okay. And finally, if that process is in place, consideration should be given as to whether you need to make a referral to DBS. If you've removed somebody from regulated activity, which again we'll go through, that's probably one of the most complex bits of the presentation. If we've removed somebody from regulated activity because they've harmed or posed a risk of harm to a vulnerable or a child, you have a legal duty to report. Okay, and we'll cover legal duty a little bit further on, as we've mentioned. So again, it's quite circular, isn't it? It's about getting the right level of checks at the right time, making sure you have really, really clear job descriptions, because the job description will help you determine what level of certificate you can get for an employee. Okay. So when you're applying for your DBS disclosures and your DBS checks, there's 4 different ones that we can look at. Okay. There's the basic check, which we said that before that we'd issued quite a huge number of, and the basic check, £23, and that will tell you unspent convictions and conditional cautions. There is no eligibility criteria. Anybody can apply for a basic check, and the individual can apply for their own basic check. Okay. Standard check includes spent and unspent convictions, cautions, reprimands and warnings, subject to filtering. And again, we'll touch on filtering. But to get a standard check, an individual cannot apply for their own. There has to be an employing body who can apply for that standard check. And the same as the enhanced. The enhanced will be unspent convictions, cautions, reprimands and warnings. But on the enhanced, you will also get relevant police information. And this is information, even though there may be no convictions or there may be no cautions, there may be police intelligence which the police feel that is appropriate to disclose because of the nature of the post that that person is going to be employed in. Okay, so there may be some police intelligence. So that's why, going back to, it's really, really important that when you are recruiting somebody or applying for DBS checks, that you have your job descriptions and you know which workforce that somebody's going to be employed in. Okay, cannot stress that bit enough. And then we go on to the enhanced barred checklists. Enhanced certificate with barred checklists, and that's looking at the barred lists for adults and children. Okay, and again, you've got your spent, unspent convictions, cautions, reprimands and warnings, subject to filtering. You've got your relevant police intelligence, which is the same as your enhanced, but then you've also got your children and or adults barred lists. And again, that will come down to when you apply for your certificate, knowing the workforce that that individual is going to work in. It asks you on the application form which workforce. And there are workforce guides provided by DBS, and again, they're on the website, which I'll send you the link to at the end of the presentation. And we've got 3 workforces. We've got the child workforce, we've got the adult workforce, and we've got the other. Okay, so anything that falls under child, you would have to tick that box that that is the workforce that that person is going to be working in. Anything that falls under adult will be adult, and anything other, which is the likes of taxi drivers, roles like that, they would fall under the other. Okay, because they don't specifically fit in child or adult. If you've got an employee who's going to be working in both, you need to mention that they are working in both workforces. The reason being is when you tick that box and that certificate comes in, that request comes into DBS, whatever is ticked in that box will be the only barred list that we will check against. So if you have ticked that somebody's going to be working in the adult workforce, we will not check the child barred list. We will only check the adult. So it's really important that you get that bit right. Okay. Filtering rules as of the 28th. We've always had filtering rules, which we mentioned on the types of DBS certificates there. We've always had filtering rules, in which case some offences are taken off the DBS certificate, and that's that's governed by legislation. We don't have any say in that. But it's just to point out that as from the 28th of November last year, those rules changed slightly. So what you see on the screen at the moment, youth cautions will no longer be disclosed on DBS certificates. Childhood reprimands and warnings will not automatically be disclosed. The police still have the power to disclose the information if it is relevant, and it ought to be disclosed. Okay, so it won't be done as a matter of course, where previously, prior to November, you may have seen them and all of a sudden you've got the same employee but they don't appear on their DBS certificate if you get a new one. That will be the reason why, is because the filtering rules have changed. But if the DBS feel, or if the police feel that they still should be disclosed, then they will still appear on the certificate. Okay, and you'll see multiple convictions. It's been removed entirely, therefore all convictions are considered individually rather than in multiply. Okay, so responding to disclosure information. Okay. When you see a certificate, you need to consider what the information means in relation to the role and any particular risk. Okay. If the person is barred, they must not be allowed to engage in any regulated activity with the group from which they are barred from. Other legal or regulatory reasons which prevent them from taking up the role need to be considered. How serious was the offence? Do you understand what the offence was? How old were they when they committed the offence, and how long ago was it? Is there a pattern of offending that maybe raises a concern? What were the circumstances? Were they in extreme hardship? Was mental health a factor? Were they in the wrong crowd at that time? Is there evidence to say that they've changed their ways? Is there evidence of rehabilitation, such as drug counselling, no recent offending, or references, etc., that demonstrate a change in behaviour? Okay, so there's lots of things that you can take into account, and that's why your Rehabilitation of Offenders Act is really important in having your guidelines set up for your recruitment process. So what were the circumstances and what needs to be done? Because something comes out on a DBS certificate is not an automatic right to not employ somebody. And what DBS does not do is we do not say, yes, you can employ them, or no, you can't. That is purely your decision based on your suitability decision-making process. Just to give you an example of that, which I think I mentioned in the first presentation that we did, situation where somebody was being line managed and their DBS disclosure check came back and it had on it an offence where in their youth they had changed the date on a tax notice, on a you know, the tax discs. I mean, I'm going back a bit here now. The tax discs that you used to get that you would display in your windscreen in your car, what they had done is they had changed the date on that, and that was a regular occurrence of an offence back in the day. But this individual had been cautioned for it, so that appeared on their DBS certificate, and the main employing body said, oh, it was a tax disc, it's absolutely fine, let's not worry about it. And I raised the question, because I was going to be line managing this individual, I raised the question of, to me, that was an offence of dishonesty. So although it was a tax disc, looking at the wider picture, what was the process of it, not just the actual offence, what was the process behind it? And therefore we did actually do a risk assessment for that individual around offence of dishonesty. And it not only protected the organisation, but it also protected the individual. So they were very clear about what was required of them, and what was, you know, what our legal duty that we had fulfilled in terms of making sure that that individual was suitable for the role that they were going to be employed in. So it's just thinking about, what do you do when you get information back on a certificate? Okay, so the update service. The update service is available to anyone who is applying for a standard or enhanced check. So it's not available for basic, but it is available for standard or enhanced. And what it does, there's actually a fee at the moment of £13, and that's an annual subscription fee. More than one certificate, so if somebody has more than one DBS certificate, they can be included in that subscription. But what the DBS update service does, the individual must subscribe to it themselves, I should say, so they must consent. And it does checks against the PNC information weekly and barred lists weekly and intelligence every 9 months. Okay, so if you've signed up for the update service, when you want to move roles, say within the same organisation, and the same criteria is required, and therefore the check that you've already got would be the relevant check for the post that you would be looking to move into. If you've signed up to the update service, the employer can check online free of charge with your consent to check that your certificate is still valid and up to date. Okay, and what that employer will get back will be one of the 4 answers that's contained in box 1. So no new information exists. The original certificate contained no relevant information. New information exists. There is no record of the certificate in service. Okay. So if you were to get back, there's no record of the certificate in service, on the basis that DBS certificates do not have a time span on them. They don't run out, so to speak. So if there's no record of a certificate in service, you need to be questioning the validity and the authenticity of the initial certificate that you had. Okay. If there is new information in terms of something has happened since the production of the last certificate and the date of the online check, all the employer will get is new information exists. It will not be told, the employer will not be told what the information is. But what that does allow the employer to do is to then go to the individual and say, we see that there's new information on your certificate, we need you to apply for a new certificate. And then that information would be disclosed on that certificate. Okay, no new information just means that the certificate is as it was when it was issued. Okay. Benefits, you can recheck when you need the individual's consent. So an individual, sometimes people only reapply for DBS certificates every 3 years. If you wanted to, as an organisation, when you're looking at your safer recruitment policies, you could say, well, actually, this individual signed up to the update service. Let's check every year if that's what they're happy for you to do. It's cheaper than a 3-yearly check because it is only £13. Whereas the other ones, as you saw, were £23.40. And you'll get faster results. You know instantly if there's no change or if you need to get a new certificate. Okay, I think DBS were turning around certificates quite quickly at the moment. I think I just applied for a new one not so long back and it came back within a week. But employers would get to know instantly if there is no change. Okay. So thinking about the right level of check at the right time, this is a bit of a funny slide and I do apologise for it. We're in the process of getting it changed because we look at it about building your foundations and then putting on your walls and windows of the house and then putting the roof on. But I'm going to have to put them up all in 3 because they start with the roof first. So looking at the foundations, okay, look at if somebody is entitled to, if we go back to, let me just go back to this slide. If somebody is entitled to a basic check, then you always need to think about, well, does the job role indicate that they should have a standard? Okay, so you start with the foundation, you start with the bottom. And if they're entitled to a standard, if they're not entitled to a standard, then that's fine, they would sit with the basic. If you look and think they're entitled to a standard, always ask yourself the question then, does this role entitle them to an enhanced? And if the answer is yes, then it should be the enhanced that you're applying for. If the answer is no, then it's the standard. And again, looking at the enhanced, does this role involve regulated activity with children or vulnerable adults? Would they be eligible to have an enhanced certificate with a barred list check? So it's looking at building your blocks up from start. Is it a basic, standard, enhanced, or enhanced with barred list that we should be applying for? Okay, and that's where your legislation falls in, and it's up to what we do very often get is we get requests for enhanced DBS certificates and enhanced with barred list checks where actually the role and the individual is not legally entitled to that check. So again, it's very important that you apply for the right level. And if you're unsure, please just give me a shout, give me a call, and I can help talk you through it so you're making the right application. Okay. So again, 5 steps to follow to decide what level of check you can get. Who your organisation provides services for. Is it children, adults, both? What the role involves. Okay, so that's about what type of activity is being undertaken. Named in legislation, teaching, training, providing healthcare, etc. How often is it performed? Some activities require that the person do them a certain number of times before they are regulated activity. And we're going to come on to a table which hopefully will help demonstrate that a bit. When you need to consider if it is supervised work, so certain activities, if supervised adequately, are not considered to be regulated activity. So, for example, a volunteer in a school, but depends again on what work they're doing and to the level of supervision that they have. Okay, and where the role is performed. So sometimes the ones above, the criteria is not met to fall under regulated activity for that job role. However, if it is carried out in a place called what's specified in legislation, so we call them specified establishments, if it falls onto a place that's specified in legislation, which means that those who work there are then in regulated activity, for example, schools, children's homes, children's hospitals in Wales. And where it says there on the slide, there's some different rules for roles in Wales that applies to your children's hospitals, because they don't specifically have those in England. Okay, and again, DBS online eligibility guidance, there's a link there, and that will be in the link at the end. And Patrick, I think you're going to be circulating or making these slides available, so people will have those links. Yeah. Fabulous, thank you. Is everybody okay? Has anybody got any questions before we move on to looking at the workforce and regulated activity, etc.? Everybody okay? I appreciate there's a lot of information that I give out.
I think Liz has a question coming up in chat a second.
I was just going to say thank you for the copy. That's really helpful because I'm scribbling down notes, so it is helpful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, not a problem. And if anybody has any questions or anything after the presentation, because I do appreciate that sometimes it, if anybody's like me, sometimes it takes me a while to process information and let it filter through. It's a bit like a coffee percolator. It's like drip, 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 and then all of a sudden I think, oh, I wished I'd asked that. So if anybody feels that after the presentation, please do feel free to come back to me. That's what I'm here for. I'm available to help and support. Okay, so we've already mentioned there are 3 types of workforce that the DBS recognises for checking purposes, and that is your child workforce, adult workforce and other workforce. These workforces are available on the gov.uk website, the dbs.gov.uk, and they're really handy when you are pulling together your job descriptions and you are looking at what you want to apply for and put in. They're really useful documents to link in with and have a look at. And they will very clearly guide you as to where you need to go in terms of eligibility for certificates. Okay, so touching on types of barring, and this is where we fall under, where you know, somebody's got a certificate, they're in employment, and we think, wait a minute, we've got a concern about the behaviour here. Okay, so there's different types of barring decisions that DBS make. We have the automatic inclusion decisions, which is your auto bar. Okay, and these are where somebody has been convicted through criminal proceedings. They're very serious offences and they are automatically barred at the point of conviction or at sentence. That information will come through to us from PNC. That comes through on a weekly basis. So there are auto bars without representation and auto bars with. Okay, but there are very few occasions where the individual, once barred or been placed on the barred list by the courts, have representation. They're few and far between. So most of them, it will come through, this person has been convicted with this offence. It's normally a sexual offence, and they are then automatically barred. The other type, disclosure information, enhanced disclosures with a barred list check that include convictions, cautions or police intelligence. What happens is that somebody might apply for an enhanced disclosure with a barred list check, and information, as I say, they may not have any the convictions etc. on their DBS, but the police have intelligence which would indicate, is it appropriate that this person is now allowed to work with children or adults, vulnerable adults? And what happens in those cases, that can be sent through to DBS via the police to say, this person has applied for this post, etc., applied for this certificate. However, we need to make consideration as to whether it's appropriate that they're allowed to work in this field of work. So we also get requests for barrels coming through from when people apply for checks. The main type of referral that we get is jumping back to the first one, which is discretionary. And that comes from employers, agencies, keepers of registers, and any supervisory authorities. And that is when somebody is working in regulated activity and there is a concern or an incident that has happened in their behaviour in relation to working with children or vulnerable adults. And to be barred from working in regulated activity, you have to be working in regulated activity, if that makes sense. Okay. So is everybody okay with that slide? So the majority of ones that you would be looking at and that you'd be thinking about would be your discretionary. Okay. So some organisations have a legal duty to refer to the DBS, and they're set out, those organisations are set out in the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006. And they are a regulated activity provider, which is an employer or voluntary organisation who are responsible for the management or control of regulated activity and make arrangements for people to work in regulated activity. Personal suppliers, an employment business, employment agency or an educational institution that makes arrangements with a person with a view to supplying that person to employers to undertake regulated activity. And an example that I can give there is that a charitable organisation who worked with children and young people were employing or were bringing in some agency staff to fill some gaps in the team while there was a sort of like an organisational restructure going ahead. And it turned out that one of those agency workers had a past previous criminal conviction for Class A drugs. That had not been disclosed to the charitable organisation by the agency, okay, but it was up to the agency to have made sure whether that person was fit and check their DBS certificate, because they were an employment agency that made arrangements with a view to supplying that person to employers to undertake regulated activity. So although the employer has some legal responsibility, so does the employment agency that sends them in. Okay. Referrals can be made using paper forms, and you can use the online service, and it allows you to upload electronic documents in support of any referral. And the same form to refer multiple individuals involved in the same incident, and therefore save it on duplicated paperwork. But some people, and I think that's where we're doing a lot of education in terms of where people have a legal duty to refer. Okay. So when you must refer, or when two main conditions have been met. Okay. Condition 1, you withdraw permission to engage in regulated activity. So that individual has been either dismissed, redeployed, retired, redundant, or resigned. And one of the myth-busting things here is one of the things that we very often come across is that employers will say, well, actually they resigned. We were doing the investigation, but the individual left the organisation and therefore we didn't think we could refer because they were no longer an employee. Absolutely, that referral still needs to go in, because what that individual can do is that they can resign from one position, I'm getting tongue-tied here, resign from one position with a particular employer, but if they're not referred into DBS and therefore that information isn't shared and that referral's not made, they can go on to work in another establishment and potentially be able to cause further harm to children or vulnerable adults. So even if the person is made redundant, they've resigned or retired, you can still make that referral if you've got a legal duty to refer. Okay. And 2, you think the person has either engaged in relevant conduct, satisfied the harm test, or received a caution for or a conviction for or have been convicted of a relevant offence. And we mentioned relevant offences before. So even if you find out somebody's been convicted of that, then you have a legal duty to refer, providing condition 1 has also been met. Okay. We want to look a little bit at relevant conduct and harm test, etc. So we're looking at a child who has not yet reached the age of 18, and an adult is a person who is aged 18 or over. One of the things for DBS is that is a very clear-cut line, and I know in some arenas and some organisations, somebody who has got additional needs can still fall under the definition of a child up to the age of, I think it's 24, 25. For DBS, it's the age of 18. So once that individual, even if they have additional needs, turns 18, they then fall into the adult workforce in terms of requirements and barring. Okay, so regulated activity. Okay, so this is regulated activity for children. And this table can help you decide if the activity is carried out is regulated, okay, and how often and when supervision has an effect. So if we look at healthcare, if somebody is providing healthcare, by a healthcare professional or someone acting under direction or supervision, it only has to happen once to be classed as regulated activity. And then there's another 2 criteria there that you can see, which is more than 3 days in a 30-day period, and once overnight with the opportunity for contact between 2 AM and 6 AM. So providing healthcare is very clear about across the board. They fall under regulated activity, as do providing personal care. So teaching training, when we're looking at that, if it happens once, it's not classed as regulated activity. But if it happens more than 3 days in a 30-day period, then yes, it is. So this is where the frequency, what we call the frequency test, falls in. But if it happens, if it happens once, it's no. If it happens more than 3 days in a 30-day period, yes. However, if it happens once and that period is overnight with the opportunity for contact, then yes, it's regulated activity. So when we think something is only happening once, we then need to look at, okay, what's the frequency? Is it overnight or is it during the day, as to deciding whether it falls under regulated activity or not. Caring and supervising, providing advice, guidance on physical, emotional, education, well-being, they fall under the same criteria and the frequency test. Okay, so driving children under arrangement. If it happens once, it's not regulated activity. If it happens more than 3 days in a 30-day period, yes, it is. If it happens once overnight, then no, it's not classed as regulated activity. Okay, so again, thinking about when the frequency test comes in. When we look at the driving children, it's under arrangement with a professional organisation. So your next door neighbour is taking your child and dropping them off at school. They do it 3 or 4 times that week because of your work arrangements and things like that. So even though they meet the frequency test, because it's done as a neighbour and it doesn't fall under regulated activity, it comes under regulated activity when we're looking at arrangements, say, by a local authority, where they transport children to school via taxi, etc., etc. Okay. So again, you can see registering to become a childminder, registering to become a foster carer does not fall under regulated activity. The registration is not regulated activity. However, the work that they then carry out could be. So it's really important in terms of local authorities that it's looked at as to what are the situations here and what are the arrangements. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on that slide? It can take a little bit sometimes to sink in, I think. Regulated activity. Yes.
Yeah, Marida's asking, why are some noted unsupervised?
Because what comes into there is the level of supervision. If teaching, training and instruction, if it's unsupervised, then if it's more than 3 days in a 30-day period, unsupervised, yes, it's regulated activity. But if you have, say, for example, a teaching assistant who is in a classroom where there is a full-time teacher, then the training assistant or the teaching assistant is not deemed to be in regulated activity because the regulated activity provider is the full-time teacher who is in the classroom with the teaching assistant. Does that make sense? Does that answer? Has that answered the question?
It does, yes.
Yeah, is that okay? And it would be the same there as caring or supervising. Somebody might be in a caring role and they could be a trainee and they would go into somebody's home maybe to provide that caring responsibilities. If they've got that full-time qualified carer with them, the full-time qualified carer would be the person who would be deemed as being in regulated activity, okay, rather than the other person who potentially could be unsupervised? Okay, good question. Okay, so we mentioned there, we've looked at the frequency tests, once more than 3 days in a 30-day period and the overnight. We also have to think about regulated activity when it comes to specified establishments. Okay, so if someone does not meet the criteria for what they do, you need to consider where they work. And these places, again, are set out in legislation because of their purpose in relation to children. Individuals working in these places may not be carrying out one of the activities listed on the previous slide, but they must satisfy all of the rules to be considered in regulated activity in specified establishments. So, if the activity takes place in a school, nursery, children's home, children's centres, childcare premises, children's hospitals in Wales, detention centres for children, and that includes pupil referral units, they must be working there more than 3 days in a 30-day period or overnight between 2 AM and 6 AM, have the opportunity for contact with children in the establishment, and work there for the purposes of the establishment, and it is not a temporary or occasional role. Okay, one of the things that would fall under that is what we look at as caretakers in schools. Okay, so they're working in a school, they don't have that direct contact with children, but they are working in a school, so they're working in this specified establishment. They're working there more than 3 days in a 30-day period. They have the opportunity for contact with the children. They work there for the purpose of the establishment, and if it's not a temporary or occasional role. Okay, so a caretaker wouldn't fall into the previous slide, into the duties that are being carried out, but they would be classed as regulated activity because they fall under the specified establishments rule. Okay. Adults are slightly more simplified when we look at adults. So healthcare is the same as it was for regulated activity with children. The definition of personal care for adults is different to the definition for children, mind, because it includes age, illness, disability, eating, drinking, toileting, washing, dressing, oral care, care of skin, hair, nails, for health reasons only. And the example that we use there is that some nursing homes provide a service where beauticians maybe come in once a week to do nail care, etc., which is it's a feel good, it's a nice thing to do, it's an emotional uplift for residents. Those beauticians would not fall under regulated activity. Okay, what they would fall under regulated activity is if it was a healthcare professional that was coming in to do nail care for an individual who needed it for healthcare reasons. Okay, so it's not cosmetic, it only falls under regulated activity if it's a healthcare need. Okay. So work with adults, which is not regulated activity. Okay, the adult must be 18 and over and receiving a listed health or social care service, which is what we've just mentioned there about, say, for the beauticians and say for a nail technician coming in to do a healthcare one, and receiving a listed activity set on legislation. The employee must do one or more of the activities below. So train, teach, instruct, provide assistance, advice or guidance, care for, supervise, provide treatment or therapy, moderate a public interactive electronic communication service, work in a care home, or drive adults under contract arrangements. And again, that driving adults under contract arrangements is the same as it is for the children. It has to be under that contract arrangement. So it's not your next door neighbour saying, I'll give you a lift to your hospital appointment. Okay. Say for hospital transport, where they would pick up, patients, say in sort of like an ambulance minibus, they would be classed as having carried out regulated activity. And again, the Adult Workforce Guide, which I've mentioned can be found on the dbs.gov.uk website, lists what's eligible for enhanced DBS checks with regulated activity for adults. So we talked before on the slide about when we're looking at when people have a duty to refer, and in the box 2 we talked about relevant conduct and we talked about the harm test. Okay, So relevant conduct is exactly what's on the slide here. It's conduct which endangers a child or adult, or is likely to endanger a child or an adult. If repeated against or in relation to a child or adult, would endanger the child or adult, or likely to endanger the child or adult. Involves sexual material relating to children, including possession of such material. Involves sexually explicit images depicting violence against human beings, including possession of such images. Is of a sexual nature involving a child or adult. So the definition of relevant conduct there is very clear. So then we look at the harm test, okay? That also falls under condition 2 when we have a duty to refer. So a person's conduct endangers a child if they harm a child or an adult, cause a child or adult to be harmed, put a child or adult at risk of harm, attempt to harm a child or adult, or incite another to harm a child or adult. And what I'd like to do is just for you to take a couple of minutes here just to have a think about, from your organisation or your sector of employment, voluntary work, can you think of examples against any or each of those bullet points on the slide? So if we just take a couple of minutes, we'll see if we can, what we come up with, and have a chat around that. Okay, so that was 2 minutes. Seems a long time when you're just sitting quiet. Does anybody have anything that they want to share, or anything that they think that would fall under any of these bullet points? Please just unmute yourselves and feel free to call out. If you're not comfortable, just put them in the chat box.
Hi, it's Annette here from SICA.
Hi.
Hi. Can I just say that a really good insight into DBS. Thank you so much. I'm finding it fascinating, and for the first time, really, really clear. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
I just wanted to, what jumped into my mind was the last bullet point, incite another to harm a child or an adult. And I'm thinking particularly about staff's conduct when they're on social media. And we have had an incident where comments were made about an adult on social media that were quite serious. So we took action on that. So, I mean, from my perspective, that's what jumped into my head when I read your list. It's that conduct outside of work and making sure that staff are aware that you know, can and will have an impact on their employment if deemed to be serious and fall into this category, you know, which yeah, it is something that we should all bear in mind, I suppose.
Absolutely, Annette, and that's a really good point, because a lot of the queries that I've had come through from different organisations, as I say, across Wales, as I represent the whole region, is where an activity or an incident has taken place. So say somebody is employed in regulated activity and they cause harm or incite to cause harm or potential to cause harm outside of their employment, they question sometimes whether that is appropriate, that referral should get made. But we're very clear in DBS about transferable behaviour and transferable risk, because if that individual is employed in regulated activity, even though that incident took place outside of their employment, the employer is still eligible to make that barring referral if they deem it appropriate. As I say, we can't tell an employer to refer. We can only say to them whether you've got a legal duty to or whether you haven't. And even if you don't meet the legal duty criteria, if you feel that somebody has satisfied the harm test, which is what we're looking at here, then absolutely you can still refer to DBS. And take action. So that's a really good point to raise about activity that takes place outside of employment. Yeah. And it's good to hear that you took action on it. So yeah, thank you for that. Anybody got any others that they want to share?
Sorry, it's Ruth here from Human Resources and Iron Bevan.
Hi, Ruth.
I think when you look at it through safeguarding and all of our health board employees' duty to safeguard, you could kind of apply these scenarios to all of our employees, both in terms of the way that they deliver care internally to the health board, and also the way perhaps that they conduct their lives outside of work and may endanger, potentially their own families or children. So we've had quite a few cases where those boundaries, I guess, have been blurred in terms of this is not a work-related safeguarding issue. It's something that's happened outside of work. The implications of that behaviour then bring into question the person's ability to safeguard in the course of their employment.
Absolutely, yeah. And that is what I'm coming across, as I've mentioned there, when I'm starting to work with people. But if you want me to come in and do any presentations, because what the other presentation that I delivered last week wasn't so much around the disclosure and the DBS checks and things like that. It was more around the duty to refer and what is harm. So we concentrated a little bit more around this side of the activity. If you feel it would be beneficial, I'm more than happy. Get in touch with me after the presentation, and we can have a chat outside, and I can come and do some presentations specifically for your organisation if you think that would be helpful. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
That would be great. Yeah, my email address will be up on the connections at the end of the slides, so you'll get it from there as well. Fabulous. Okay, thank you. And that applies for anybody that's on today's session, that if anybody wants to contact me afterwards to come along to do something specific for your organisations, again, I'm more than happy to do that. That's what I'm here for. Rather than you guys go out and try and cascade the information, just bring me in and I'll just repeat it and go over it for everybody. Yeah. Okay. So looking at the different bullet points then, some examples of harm to a child or an adult could be physically pushing a resident to the floor. It could be a child being smacked in school. I don't know about people that are in the audience, but I can take you back to my school days. I try to think I'm not that old, but I can take you back to my school days where it was a regular occurrence for children to get smacked either with the cane or by a slipper. And you think, well, actually, looking back now, that was harm. And it's no longer tolerated in schools, but there are occasions where things like that still do happen. Causing a child or adult to be harmed. So lack of supervision, say for example during a school trip, where there is a lack of supervision and a child is harmed or put at risk, say a child goes missing or something like that. So that lack of supervision caused a child or adult to be harmed. Putting a child at risk of harm, so an example of that could be sleeping during a waking night shift. Certainly in some care homes and residential homes, we've all heard on the news about harm that's been caused and different things that fall under that category. Attempting to harm a child or an adult. So if we use what we used in the first one as physically pushing a resident or a child to the floor, if somebody attempted to do that but was intervened by another member of staff and they stopped it from actually happening, then that original individual still attempted to harm that child or adult, and therefore that still falls under the harm test. And inciting another to harm a child or an adult. Again, example that I've got here is about a care assistant advising another member of staff to double pad residents on a night time, so that means that they don't have to go back and visit them through the night, things like that. So if if somebody said, oh, double pad that lady in that room, because then we can sit and have our cuppa in peace, that is harm. So they're all just some examples of what can fall under that category. So the harm test is satisfied when relevant conduct cannot be established, but it appears to the DBS that a person may harm a child or an adult who is in receipt of regulated activity, cause a child or adult who is in receipt of regulated activity to be harmed, put a child or adult who is in receipt of regulated activity at risk of harm, attempt to harm a child or adult who is in receipt of regulated activity, or incite another. So it's just looking back at those bullet points, etc., and thinking that we would deem the harm test to be satisfied. But not everything needs to be in action. Sometimes people might express thoughts or feelings which, if acted upon, would cause or put someone at risk of harm. And one of these, for example, might be someone disclosed to a colleague that they were having thoughts of a sexual nature about children in their care. This would be considered by DBS as a risk of potential future harm, even if they had not acted on those thoughts at that time. Okay, so just bear in mind, not everything has to be an actual action at that time. It can be just a passing comment by somebody that makes you kind of stop and raise an eyebrow and kind of think, whoa, wait a minute, that was a bit strange. That's worrying. So think about that. So just looking at then some examples of abuse and harm. If we want to take a couple of minutes just to have a read of this slide, rather than me read it all out to you.
Carol, Liz asks if an employee accepts a community resolution order from the police by way of diffusing a situation so it won't escalate going into court, should this be referred to the DBS?
If the person is in regulated activity and the criteria has been met, then it would still need to be, even though they have accepted that sanction, it would still need to be referred if the legal duty to refer has been met. If we look back to condition 1 and condition 2, when we looked at legal duty, then yes, it would still need to be referred. If we believe that that person would satisfy the harm test, so even though that they have accepted that sanction based on the evidence of that incident, if we believe that there would be an ongoing and they would satisfy the harm test, then an employer can still refer that individual through to the DBS. And I think one of the important things to remember there is that whilst the employer is, and when I talk about employer, I'm talking paid employment and volunteer organisations, when that referral is made through to the DBS, all that the employer and the individuals are doing is providing the information. It is not the employer or the individual who will make the decision as to whether that individual is barred or not. And again, I've had an example last week where a referral was made, but the incident that had taken place had been somebody had suffered extreme personal circumstances the night before coming into work. They came into work and out of character, an incident happened which put somebody at risk of harm. Now, that individual was working in regulated activity, the conditions were met, and therefore the employer had a legal duty to make that referral. But the employer contacted me because they were really wrestling with, this is a one-off incident. We know the circumstances that happened the night before this individual came in. They've got an exemplary record at work, but yet we have met the legal duty to refer. What do we need to do? You know, and unfortunately, they were right in coming to the conclusion that they had a legal duty to refer that individual. But I think how they were able to then accept it and get around it a little bit more was the fact that they are providing the information. They are not making the decision as to whether to refer that individual or not. And when we go back to looking at the barring slide, when we talk about the disclosure, any barring referral that is made through the disclosure route, which would be the ones that people would refer in mainly, the individual has got right to representation. So they will get, when it goes through so far in the process, I think on the slides last week I actually showed the different stages that it goes through. When it goes through those stages, it will reach a stage where the individual has got 8 weeks and 2 days of a time span to respond to any allegations that have been made, and they would have their right to representation as to why they feel they should not be barred. So if in doubt and you think the criteria is met, well, if the criteria is met to legally refer, then my advice would always be to legally refer, because there are sanctions where people don't. And I'm not here to scaremonger people or to frighten people, but it can be an unlimited fine, as from March 2015. There's no top limit on it. Would be a sanction. But even if you feel that somebody satisfies the harm test, then if you think that you are potentially saving somebody from experiencing that harm in the future, then I would say to put the referral into DBS and let DBS decide, based on all the evidence and all the information they've got, whether that individual needs to be barred or not. So yeah, even if they've been removed from regulated activity, redeployed, resigned, retired, redundant, you can still put that referral in, even if they've accepted that sanction from the police. A very long answer there, but hopefully it was quite useful.
Liz says, thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you. Okay, so have we had a look at the examples of abuse and harm on this slide? Has anything jumped out and struck anybody thinking, oh, didn't realise that, or I didn't think about that side of it? Or is everything quite clear, quite what you would expect to see under each of those headings? Yep. Somebody want to speak?
Yep.
Yeah,
I could
sorry.
hear the microphone go on.
Thank you. The point is, to be honest, I can't on my laptop. This isn't visible clearly to me. I can't read it, to be honest. So I was waiting to get the the email to me, and then I can look at them in detail. A very mild thing compared to some of the subjects we're having to deal with, but as local fundraisers, sometimes when we've had stalls or anything like that, we've got a query which we're taking up with our Friends of the Earth people. I'm a local coordinator for Friends of the Earth, and we used to do a thing like guessing games where children were engaged in payment to join in a guessing game, like higher or lower with the cards or things like that, or even we wondered whether in fact this could be seen as an incitement to gamble, and or an invitation to gamble, and we were wondering whether we'd be safe therefore to say you can't play this unless your parents give you permission.
That wouldn't be something that DBS would advise on. You would need to look at sort of like a gambling organisation to take some advice on that as to what the system would be in terms of that. I do think that it would be advisable to get parents' consent, because I definitely do see where you're coming from. Where DBS would kind of sit on that is looking to see whether or not you would want to have, if you think back to the different levels and eligibility for DBS checks, whether you wanted to have all people who were involved in that activity from your organisational perspective They wouldn't be entitled to standard or enhanced checks, but they could, if they wanted to, or you wanted to as an organisation, ask everybody to have a basic DBS check. And therefore, what you would be doing as an organisation would be reassuring that yourself that those people that you are asking to carry out those activities don't have any previous cautions, convictions or anything like that for, say, gambling offences. So that would be something that you could think about.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so just thinking about this, sorry, what I should say, and going back to this slide, when we talk about harm, it's not defined in legislation. Okay, so DBS view harm as its common understanding or the definition that you would find in a dictionary, and harm is considered in its widest context. So it includes right across the board that we've mentioned there. One of the things that I do want to mention under neglect actually very quickly is it says about untreated weight loss, failing to administer reasonable care, etc., etc. In terms of children, failing to take a child to a medical appointment, and my background before I came to DBS was working in children's charities with children on child protection plans and edge of care. And one of the things that we very often came across was parents saying, oh yes, we've got a doctor's appointment, but I couldn't make it because we missed the bus, or I forgot to make that appointment, or I forgot we had that appointment, and things like that. So that basic taking a child to a medical appointment or to have some treatment if they complain of a sore tummy, or etc., etc., if it's done on a regular basis, can actually be classed as neglect. So it's things like that. If you notice that a child has, maybe complained of a sore tummy for quite some time, maybe a few days or more, and nothing is being done by the parent, then you need to start to think about, actually, what do we need to do with this? Because we're not seeing any change here. Is this a possible neglect that this child is experiencing? Okay. So yeah, just to sort of bring us to a conclusion, really, DBS under legislation are the people, apart from the courts, who will make a decision as to whether somebody is suitable to work with children or vulnerable adults, and the DBS are the organisation through legislation who will bar somebody. So what we say to organisations, if you're not going to make the referral to us, how will we know what's happening out there? How will we know about that individual? Okay. And if you don't make the referral to DBS, the person may go on to cause further harm to a vulnerable person or a child. If you do make the referral to DBS, we will consider all of the evidence when deciding whether a person should be barred. And I think I've touched on that before when I was giving the example. What you guys will be doing is you will be providing us with your documentation, your evidence and your concerns. It will be up to the DBS to make that decision. And that person will always have that representation if it's done under that disclosure route. And DBS will only bar them from working with vulnerable groups if it is the right thing to do. Okay, it's not that every person that gets referred to DBS gets barred. And as promised, useful links. So you've got DBS guidance leaflets, DBS check the process explained in a video. That's actually a really, really good video to watch. It's just unfortunate we don't have time to include it when we're doing these presentations. Eligibility, what check do I need to get for my employee? The guidance for enhanced DBS checks, when they're entitled, when you're not. DBS barring referral guidance, the form and guidance for that, and how to make a good quality barring referral. Okay, DBS Conference 2021, there is some information on the website about that. The conference is next week, it's the 24th and 25th of March. Hopefully some of you have managed to get on it. Unfortunately, if you haven't, it is fully booked with the waiting list now. But if it is something that you're interested in, please do send your name in to be added onto that waiting list, because we just don't know whether we're going to have any more spaces that become available or not. So if you don't put your name down, then we won't know that you're interested. But yeah, there's a two-day conference next week. Okay. So again, how to contact us. I am the Regional Outreach Officer for Wales, and I am part of the Partnership and Engagement team. So if you've got any questions or anything that you want, or any organisations, like I think it was Ruth mentioned before, if you want me to come along and do any presentations to your particular organisation, please do drop me an email at carolanne.eland@dbs.gov.uk. For some reason, DBS give me my Sunday name when they set me up on the system, but please just do call me Carol. It's not Carol Ann. And if you get an out of office email response, because if I'm not in the office, I will always put my out of office on. If I'm on holiday or leave or anything, you will get the out of office that will direct you to the DBS engagement email address. Okay, and again, there's some further information on barring and further information on disclosure. If you don't want to come through myself, you can always contact those customer service helplines. Okay.